rest of my term where you are going to be surprised, embarrassed, or ashamed of my behavior, because that is the complete list of things that I am ashamed of. And if you think that you can get away with these things in this age, especially if you're a Republican and a conservative, you cannot. This information will come out sooner or later. And the reason that we don't get people running for office of the kind of caliber we should have is because the political process is so destructive to human lives. There's so much dirt that's dug up on anybody that every single one of you in this room today has things that you're ashamed of, and most of you are deterred from going into office because you either have a good job that you don't want to leave, or you don't want to see your family destroyed because some filthy muckraker somewhere dug up something that you did 35 years ago. I'm not going to be held hostage to these people. I'm going to tell you about this now. And you can make your own decisions about me. And you should weigh these decisions very carefully, by the way, because every single one of these 4 things that I've listed are serious moral failings. They're serious issues, and you need to think about them very carefully. But I'm leading with these things. I lead with the skeletons. Because that takes courage. It takes courage to do that. This isn't fun. It takes courage to tell the truth to the American people. Now, I've told you the truth. If you want to get up and leave, that's fine. But everything you're going to hear from me from now on is going to be the truth. I'm not afraid to speak it. I've already cleared that hurdle. I just cleared it just now. So, moving on. We have to reconcile ourselves to this fact that our society is changing very, very rapidly in a number of different ways, but in the most important way that it's changing is we are actually at the cusp of not a change that occurs every 20 years or even every 100 years. We're at the cusp of a change that has occurred only 3 times in all of human history. Because our economy is changing. And as Thaddeus McCotter, who's a brilliant, brilliant representative, pointed out to me, he really turned me on to this idea. If the economy changes, if the kind of economy we have changes, then the government will have to follow. The government is based to manage the people and the economy. The government doesn't tell us what kind of an economy to have. It manages, it tries to govern the economy that exists. So let me just tell you a very quick story. There's been only 3 real ages in the history of mankind. There's the agricultural age, which began about 7,000 years ago in Babylon, in modern-day Iraq, strangely enough, where people started growing crops for food, and that meant that they could have cities. And once you had cities, you had division of labor, and you could have poets, and you could have special soldiers and artisans and civilization. And that was the agricultural age, and it lasted for almost 5, 6, 7,000 years. Our founding fathers, who drew up our Constitution, were products of an agricultural age America. Very dispersed America, very independent America, very self-reliant America. Almost all Americans lived on farms at the time of the founding of the country. So they wrote a government that was based upon this idea of self-reliance, independence, and freedom. Of course you wouldn't want to restrict the guns of a person who's living in Kentucky in 1789. It'd be suicide. It'd be absolutely insane. So the government that we have today is the product of a first-era agricultural age. Now, right around the turn of the 20th century, late 1800s, but mostly early 1900s, the world changed. The Industrial Revolution happened. The Industrial Revolution means machines and factories. Factories means lots of people living in close proximity. The country became much more urban. People started to move into cities. And we started to see progressive amendments to the Constitution that dealt with this changing economy, that dealt with the problem of urban populations. Things like transportation and health care and restrictions on guns and these kind of things. And right now, we are living with this decaying, ancient, rotting carcass of a second-era industrial government that sits on this society like a gigantic, huge, fat, enormous hunk of granite. It's this big, top-down, centralized thing that lives in Washington, and it's designed to run an industrialized, centralized economy. But we do not live in that age anymore. We no longer live in the industrial age. We're still in it somewhat, but we're moving to the information age. Now, I know that's a lot of information, but what am I trying to say? What I'm trying to say is inevitable. It is inevitable that this government is going to change, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat who's running it, Republican or Democrat Congress, it's going to change. Because this big, slow, stupid, monolithic, uniform, gigantic aneurysm of a government represented by this building behind me today, the Capitol building, cannot possibly administer an economy where somebody like me or somebody like you can pull out your cell phone and order steel from China right now. This economy is so decentralized, it's so fast, it's so networked, it's so agile, it's so competitive. No way can a government like that administer an economy like the one that is here and coming more and more every day. And young people understand this better than anybody. So the government is going to change whether it's a Republican or a Democrat. And I want to talk to you about what this new future looks like for America. Because it's a beautiful future. It's an incredible future. It is the true realization of everything we've always hoped for, finally. It's extremely democratic. It's not vertical. It's not top-down controlled. It's horizontal. It's democratic. It's talent-risen. It's a remarkable future. We have more energy under our feet today than we had when we first drilled it into the surface of the earth 200 years ago. Through genius, we have incredible possibilities. And all of these possibilities are sat upon us by this gigantic monolith represented by the building behind me. So, we have to talk about a new kind of politics. And a new kind of politics is a politics that looks at this new economy that this government is going to have to govern. How do we get from one place to another? That's the trick, isn't it? Because when we tell people that we want a new government, a smaller government, a lighter government, a faster government, frankly, a government that fits back in its original container, many people today hear smaller government. I'm dependent on government. Smaller government means you people are trying to kill me. You're trying to take away my paychecks. You're going to make me watch my children starve in front of me. I'm not saying that. No one's saying that. We cannot simply destroy this government, and nor should we. We are not going to put people out on the streets. We're not going to take away their Social Security. We're not going to do any of these things. How do you get from one gigantic thing to another? You can't simply destroy this because people's lives depend on this government as it exists today. We have to build a parallel structure. Imagine a building that has everybody living in it. It's our big house. It's a multi-story building, and it's rotting. It's just rotting out of age. I'm not saying change the building's code, the structure, the blueprint, the Constitution is perfect. But this structure is getting old. We can't just knock that building down. What we have to do is we have to build a new building next to it. And as this new building goes up, it becomes more and more completed. More and more people will move into the new building, not because we're going to make them do it at the point of a gun, because the new building is a better building. It's just nicer. It's a better place to live. So parallel structures are what we're going to have to use in order to get to a world where the government gets smaller. And I could spend the rest of the speech talking about those parallel structures, but that's not what an inauguration speech is about. An inauguration speech is about a vision. So trust me when I say things like homeschooling or co-ops for medical treatment or so on. All of these things are parallel structures, and we can explore those later. What I do want to talk about is the three things that this new government, this new politics, this new kind of politician are going to have in common, and I really think it's only three things. And the first of these things is we have to constantly remember, and it's very hard for us to remember, but we have to constantly remember that our first real constant objective is human freedom. It's very hard for young people to understand this point. It's even hard for those of us who are older to understand this point, because after 250 years of living free, we just assume that freedom is the default state of mankind, and it is not. It is not. All of our freedoms, which we breathe in through the air, which we think are indestructible, which we think can never go away. Of course we can trust politicians. Of course executive orders. No, massacres and death camps could never come here. No, 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 we're free, good, decent people. Nonsense. They've come everywhere at every time. Freedom is extremely rare. And everything that we do moving forward as a people has got to be primarily motivated by human freedom, which is often expressed as an abstract term. We conservatives talk about freedom and we point to this old document in which we the people and all of these abstracts, but freedom is much, much simpler than that. Freedom fundamentally is, I'm going to do what I want to do. You don't get to tell me what to do. I should be able to do anything I damn well want to, and the only consequences of freedom are that I must be responsible for the actions that I undertake as a free person. There's not a person in this country that wants to be told what to do by people that they don't respect or don't admire or don't have any legitimacy for. I don't care what party you're in. I don't care what your ideology. Nobody wants to be told what to do. And as long as we focus our government primarily on this idea of freedom, then we will succeed, because everybody wants to be free. The problem is nobody realizes the cost of freedom. They take freedom for granted. So when I talk about freedom, let me give you an example. not going to talk about guns, I'm not going to talk about policy, I'm not going to talk about taxes. Let's talk about freedom in a way that every single person can understand it. Every single person. This is what living in a free country means. Up until the time of very recently, within the last 10 or 20 years, certainly when I was a boy, which was 30, 40 years ago, right? Freedom meant this. I'm out there on the sidewalk, and I see a guy, and he's got a skateboard I like. And I said, hey, dude, that is a really sweet skateboard. You want to sell it? He goes, I don't know. What you offering for it? I'll give you $150 for it. Yeah, okay. He gives him the $100. The guy gives him the skateboard. Said, have fun, dude. And off he goes. That's the country I grew up in. That's a free country. Now what happens if we want to do this today? You think I'm joking, but I'm not. I'm about to tell you the truth because everything I'm about to say already exists. Okay? So in a free country, you can walk up to a guy and say, you want to sell that skateboard? Yeah. Here's your money. Here's your skateboard. Thank you very much. Goodbye. But today, in America, here's how much freedom we've actually lost. You want to buy a skateboard? Absolutely, dude. Well, you're the guy selling the skateboard, you're the guy buying the skateboard. Before you can sell the skateboard, you have to have a safety inspection certificate for the skateboard. You have to certify that the wheel bearings are in good condition. You have to make sure that the oil on the bearings is EPA approved oil and is not harmful to the environment. You have to provide warning levels on the skateboard. The warning labels have to say things like, but not limited to, maximum load of the skateboard, maximum safe speed of the skateboard. Do not eat the skateboard, and this vehicle does not allow the user to fly. You're going to need to do a carbon tax on the neoprene and the plastic on those skateboards because they consume produce a lot of carbon, so we're going to have to tax the skateboard for that, which means we're going to have to add that to the price, needless to say. You're going to have to do lead testing on the skateboard, by the way, because if you sell any product to somebody under the age of 18, you have to certify that there are no lead products in that skateboard. It doesn't matter that you didn't build the skateboard, you're selling the skateboard. You're required by law to prove that there is no lead in that skateboard, which means we're going to have to destructively test the skateboard. We're going to have to take a piece about that big out of the middle. And it's going to cost you $6,000 to do that test, but these are the price of safety for our children. Now, in addition to this, of course, you're going to have to conform to the Consumer Product Safety Act, Improvement Act of 2009. That's the lead testing. You're also going to have to show to me that the wood that's in the skateboard, you're going to have to source the wood. You're going to have to convince me, you the seller, not the manufacturer, you the seller, are going to have to prove that the wood was taken, that was not taken from endangered species, because if it was taken by an endangered species of wood, you are in violation of the Lacey Act and in violation of U.S. import laws. So we're going to have to test that wood too to make sure that that wood is legal wood. And if you don't believe me, just ask Gibson Guitars about this particular issue. You're also going to have to provide an instruction manual for the skateboard. And it has to be provided in English, Spanish, French, Chinese, Japanese, and Italian. And also, when you sell the skateboard, you're going to have to provide well-documented maintenance record that the skateboard has been adequately maintained for the life of the skateboard. And finally, you're going to have to buy yourself a significant insurance policy, because if this person takes a skateboard and kills himself with it, he is going to come back and sue you. It's your fault for selling him the skateboard, because there is no more individual responsibility in this country. That's what happens when there's no freedom. There's no responsibility either. Now, we're not done, of course. We're not even halfway there. Because before you can buy the skateboard, the first thing you're going to have to do is provide a notarized bill of sale for the skateboard. And that means you're going to have to show that you paid all applicable state, local, and federal taxes on the skateboard. We'll need to have this certified, needless to say. You're going to have to provide property and liability damage that may occur to anybody who you may injure with a skateboard, any property that you might injure with a skateboard. You're going to have to certainly supply a certificate of a completion of a skateboard safety course. It's an 8-hour course. It includes a written and practical test convincing us that you know how to operate the skateboard safely. That's really important. We don't want to get anybody injured out there. You're going to have to provide a current medical certificate from a doctor certifying that you're in good physical health, good enough physical health so that you don't have a heart attack while on the skateboard, because that could injure somebody. You're going to have to pass a drug test, and that's the end of skateboard sales, as we all know. You're going to have to pass a background check. And we're going to demand a background check because we want to make sure that you have no skateboard violations in the past. It would be irresponsible of us to let you have a skateboard if it turns out that you're the kind of person who's already injured 3 or 4 people with a skateboard. We can't allow that. That's just a violation of public safety rules. That's just common sense. Needless to say, All times operating the skateboard, you're going to have to wear a helmet, certified knee pads and shoulder pads and wrist pads and waist pads. And you can't just put something on. They have to be either ASTM certified or CPSC certified. And you're going to have the labels on those pads to make sure that they are in fact actually certified. And if you should decide to use your skateboard on a public road at a speed greater than 10 miles an hour going from one point to another, you are now, according to the Department of Transportation, a vehicle. And as a vehicle, you have to provide airbags, a 15,000 candle power headlights, a horn, a speedometer, taillights, seat belts, and so on. Oh, by the way, if you should be killed on that skateboard, then we're going to ban skateboards. Not all skateboards, just high-performance skateboards. And if we save just one life, won't that be worth it? I forgot something. Have fun, dude. The skateboard is going to cost you $17,950. It's going to take you 6 years for all of these forms to be approved and filled out. Now, those are actual laws. I didn't make that stuff up. And who writes these laws, but more importantly, who enforces the laws? One of the reasons this government is so expensive is because there's a standing army of people that don't produce anything other than make sure that you can't take $150 so that you can have a skateboard and have a good time. Their sole purpose, all they do, is make sure that your skateboard costs $17,000 and you can't have any fun with it. That's what the government does. So when we say we want to get government back into its original wrapper, I'm not saying no government, I'm not saying no welfare, I'm not saying no safety net. I'm saying, can we please, 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 please stop this idiocy? We're supposed to be a bunch of people who are here to have fun. Life is supposed to be fun. They didn't put the pursuit of happiness in there for nothing. Thomas Jefferson was supposed to write, among these truths are life, liberty, and property, because that's exactly what had been written in the Virginia Charter, but something happened to that man. I am convinced on the spur of the moment. He said, you know what? Let's go larger than that. The pursuit of happiness. Not the guarantee of happiness, the pursuit of happiness. And when you take a fundamentally optimistic people, a fundamentally happy people, and you burden them with this kind of nonsense over the smallest possible transaction, you have pretty compelling evidence that the government is too big. It doesn't belong in this transaction between two people who just want to buy a skateboard. And furthermore, if you go out and buy that skateboard today, after my example, you are in violation of federal laws, because this isn't a joke. I'm not kidding. Every single person in this room right now is in violation of 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 state and local and federal laws at any given time. You become a nation of criminals because the criminals in Congress write laws that you don't know about and expect you to obey them. And if you don't, well, that's not their problem, that's your problem. It's too big. It's too stupid. It's too heavy. It's too slow. It's too monolithic. It's got to go. It's got to go. It's time to go. Now, so, freedom. That's number one. The second thing that we have to understand as Americans, and that I'm going to be talking about the duration of my virtual presidency, is a very simple concept. And the reason this concept is one of the three things I'm going to continue to come back to is because what I'm about to talk about is what divides liberals into conservatives. It's what's dividing the country in half, in fact. Ultimately, when you get downstream of all the politics and all the social engineering and welfare entitlements, all this other stuff, it all actually comes down to a very, very simple point. And I'm going to make this point every time I can. And the second thing we have to understand in this new era of an enlightened future, of a future of prosperity and opportunity for everybody, is we have to talk about this idea of wealth creation. We have to get out of our heads what's been put in our heads, but what we used to understand for virtually our entire history as Americans. We have to understand that wealth can be generated out of thin air. And if you don't understand that and believe it, then you are a prisoner of this scarcity mentality that is so alien to everything we believe, and is the source of all of these regulations. This skateboard stuff is the result of people not believing that wealth is infinite. So I'm going to have to take just a few moments to convince you. Why? wealth is infinite, that wealth can be created out of thin air. Because if you believe it, if I can convince you that wealth is creatable out of thin air, then that will change all of the politics downstream. This is a fundamental issue. So, how do you generate wealth? Well, there's really three ways that you can actually make wealth out of thin air. The first way you can do it is just through the act of creativity, through imagination. For example, if I go down to Kinko's and I buy a legal pad for $1, and I buy a pen for $1, and I write the screenplay for Weekend at Bernie's 2, Bernie's Revenge, let's say, and I sell it to Hollywood. Hollywood buys that screenplay for $1 million of wealth that wasn't there before. Now, people could say, no, you just move money from a studio to here, but that's not true. Because people will work harder than they need to work so that they can go see movies. You could all survive on a little bit less money if you cut your entertainment budget. You work a little bit harder than you need to because you'd like to be entertained. So people will work harder to be entertained, and so this script is worth $1 million. You've generated $1 million of wealth that wasn't there before. And it doesn't have to be a song or a poem. It could be something like a business plan for a dry cleaning shop, or it could be a sketch for a building where there was a vacant lot. Now there's an office building. That's wealth. It's not money. Money is what we exchange for wealth. I'll get in that in a minute. You've created wealth out of thin air just by imagining it. You know, when they wrote The Bridge on the River Kwai, which was about English prisoners of Japan during World War II, they said that the Japanese went out into the jungle, they hacked some bamboo together, they strung it together with vines, they let a train or two go over it, the bridge would collapse, and they'd go out and build it again. But the Western mind, with the British prisoners, sat there, they designed the blueprints, they figured out how much weight the soil would be able to take, they did all of this stuff. The point the author was trying to make is they built the bridge in their head, down to the last nail, before they ever went out into the real world. The ability to vision it, the ability to envision things, to see things in your mind that weren't there before. Maybe it's an app for the iPhone that you thought would be cooler. Or maybe it is a little convenience store. Maybe it's who knows what it is. Maybe you want to build duck decoys. If it wasn't there before, but you envision it, if you bring it into the real world, you've generated wealth. The wealth wasn't there before. You see, if wealth can be generated, then businessmen and entrepreneurs are the good guys, because they're generating wealth that wasn't there before. If wealth cannot be generated, then a guy with a $20 million jet is actually a villain. So which one is it? Well, if you look at Los Angeles in 1865, you can find this picture online. It's a couple of adobe huts, a hitching post, and a donkey. I just flew over it on the way out here. It's improved somewhat since then. So where did it come from? Where did it come from? Where did the Mercedes-Benzes and the flat-screen TVs and the MRI machines and the cell phones and the air conditioners and the elevators and all the faucets and all the electrical appliances, where did that come from? We didn't steal it from Djibouti. We didn't go overseas and take it from the third world. Of course wealth can be generated out of it. Of course it can. So, second way you can add wealth is by adding complexity. Once I had the worst job I ever had. I was a temp. I lasted at this job for about half an hour. And they said to me, here's a list of, it was for an insurance company, here's a computer printout, that old green and white computer paper with the holes down the side. Here's a list of people who filed a claim, and here's a list of people, or a complaint, and here's a list of people who we've written checks to. And you're supposed to go through this list, find the number, and go over to this list and check off that they got their check. And it was this thick. I said, got it. I can't do this job. Don't you understand? No, I understand it. I just can't do it. But the point is this, that was the worst job I ever had. I got paid $7.50 an hour for that job. So how did that job generate wealth? Because if it didn't generate some kind of wealth, there's no reason to pay me. Well, then I realized that a cross-check list is more valuable than one that's not cross-checked. In other words, if I catch a problem at $7 an hour, that means that person doesn't go talk to a manager who's working at $100 an hour. And ultimately, it means maybe they don't cancel their insurance policy, which costs that company $50,000, $100,000, $200,000 over the course of their life. This simple, stupid act of cross-checking this list generated wealth. It added complexity, made that list more valuable. Isn't that amazing? But the real way that we generate wealth is through trade. And the best way to talk about this is to talk about getting an economy down to very, very simple terms. So come with me back now to prehistoric times. There's really only two groups of people in the world. We have a hunter tribe that lives up in the mountains, and we have a gatherer tribe that lives down by the seashores. The hunter tribe does nothing but hunt. They have excellent spears. They live and die by their spears. Their spears are strong and straight. They've got these elaborate stone spearheads. They carve pictures of buffalo in them. And they go through about a spear a day, breaking a spear a day. But they are absolutely magnificent spears. But they don't gather a whole lot, so their baskets look like birds' nests. Now, Down on the shore is a gatherer tribe. They don't get to do much spearing. They have wobbly sticks that they throw at a fish. It doesn't fly very straight. It'll break more often than not. But they're baskets because they gather. Their baskets are woven tight enough to hold water. Now one day, a person from the hunter tribe meets a person from the gatherer tribe in the Midlands, and they look at each other, and using sign language and so on, the hunter says, "That is the nicest basket I have ever seen in my life." And the guy from the gatherer tribe says, "Well, allow me to say, sir," in response, that is, without question, the finest spear that I've ever seen in my life. So these two guys get this brilliant idea, and they decide they're going to swap the really good spear for the really good basket. Now both the hunter goes back to the tribe with a good basket, and the gatherer goes back to the tribe with a good spear. And the fundamental question is, and this is the miracle right here, which one of them goes back wealthy? And we need to understand this in our bones, because it's the freedom to do these things, to sit in a garage and come up with an idea for a computer that everybody could afford, or an app, or a video game, or something. The ability to think of something and go out and do it. That's why we're the richest country in the world before these people got their fingers on things. But when we can no longer make these trades anymore, then we will not be a rich country anymore. We'll be a poor country. And the more these people sit on this process, the poorer we become. And not just poorer financially either. Poorer intellectually and poorer spiritually. Because every single one of you out there at some point in your lives have had an idea about something that you could have done. And the harder it gets to bring that thing out of your head into the real world, the poorer society gets in terms of money, and the poorer we get morally and spiritually and intellectually. So my entire argument to the American people is this. You think the government gives you things. It doesn't. The government's presence sits upon a process that can provide us with so much prosperity, so much wealth for everyone. You don't have to be an inventor. You don't have to be a businessman. If you let inventors and businessmen do their jobs, they have to hire people. The more jobs there are, the more they're willing to pay for scarcer employees. Wages go up. We are sitting on more energy than we've ever had in our lives. It's cheaper than it's ever been. We have the means to communicate through the internet and these devices that we've never had before. We are on the verge of the most miraculous renaissance in human history, and the only thing in the way are the people in this big white building behind me who will not let us get on with it. It has to stop. It has to stop. Government has a place. We're not saying no government. We're not saying eliminate these structures that people are dependent on. We're saying let other people do things that are better, and people will move from the decaying system to the good system. So number 2 is wealth creation. And the final thing I'll tell you in terms of our new government, of what the government of the future has to look like is, it is a very simple word. It's a very simple word. The government of the future, like the government of the past, but unlike the government of today, is dependent on a quality that does not exist in Congress in any measurable quantity, and is rapidly declining in the general population. For us to remain free, happy, successful, prosperous people, the third quality that we must maintain is virtue. Virtue. Now, many liberals hear a white conservative male talk about virtue, and you think I'm talking about not having sex till you're 70 or something. That's not what I'm talking about at all. That's not what virtue is. You can have sex with as many people as you want to, as an example, and that's not an unvirtuous thing to do. If you have sex with an awful lot of people and you're married, that is an unvirtuous thing to do. So what is virtue? What does it mean? Virtue means very simple. It means do what you say you're going to do. In fact, you could take all of the laws of the entire society and reduce them down to 2. Do not infringe upon other people's freedoms or their property. That's number 1. That's the basis of criminal law. And do what you say you're going to do. That's the basis of contract law or tort law. That's all you need. 2 laws. These laws are based on virtue. And we often talk about how the young generation is virtuous and they seem lost. My experience with millennials is these are some of the most moral people I've ever met. They're deeply concerned about injustice. They're deeply concerned about playing fair. So my definition of virtue is actually very simple. I'm not going to give you a classical definition of virtue. I'll give you a working definition of virtue. To me, virtue means do the right thing as often as you can. We're human beings and we're faulty human beings. That's why we have a government that limits human power, because all of our hearts are faulty. You heard about my faults earlier. We're all faulty people. But a government that has a virtuous population does not need to sit on them with whips and chains, because a virtuous people will fundamentally govern themselves. They don't need to be governed by above, by the smart people, by the connected people, by the people that make 10,000 laws that you're in violation of every time. Virtuous people don't need laws saying, don't steal this. We don't need security cameras everywhere we go, because virtuous people don't steal. But when everybody starts stealing, when stealing becomes accepted, then there needs to be security cameras everywhere, and security guards, and courtrooms, and all of these other things. So virtue is just do the right thing as often as you can. If we have a government based on freedom, wealth creation, and virtue, we will see a future the likes of which this country has never seen. And that's my mission for the next 4 years. That's all I want to talk about. I want to talk honestly about what's wrong with this country. I want to talk about getting the kind of people in Washington that the American people deserve. We need people who go to Washington and look at it as a chore. I don't want this job. I don't want to be virtual president. I just don't know who's going to talk about these things. Somebody has to. So when we talk about the years to come, I want every single one of you to ask yourself a very important question. Can you take 2 years out of your busy lives, your competent lives, your lives that are connected to real people, 2 years or 4, and go to Washington and fix this mess and come home covered in glory instead of kicked out after 30 years of corruption? Take what you know, go there, put it in a room with 500 other people, and then come back home again. That's how it's supposed to be, you know. We all talk about the power of democracy, but we don't live in a democracy. There's only 535 Americans at any given time that live in a democracy. There's 435 members of the House of Representatives, and there's 100 senators. They live in a democracy. They get to vote on what affects all the rest of us. We don't live in a democracy. We live in a republic. We send them to vote for us. And we're in the trouble we're in because of the quality of the people that we have sent here. Now, I'm a conservative Republican. I would tell you with absolute honesty, as everything else I'll tell you with honesty, that I would rather see a Congress composed of 435 Democrats and 100 Senator Democrats who had just come from the real world, who had real-world experience and understood that the Constitution limits their power. I'd rather have a Congress made up of 535 Democrats who understood that thing than the Congress we have today. Absolutely, I'd rather have that. So I don't care what party you're from. I don't care what you believe. We're supposed to argue. When you hear people call for unity, that's not America. America's compromise. America's a group of different people with different means who try to figure out how we can all live with each other. And that's what we're going to try to do. God bless all of you. Thank you very much for coming. And I'd be happy to take your questions as Virtual President of the United States. And I'd like them tough, please. It actually gets a lot more fun if we, if we do. Hey, Mr. Virtual President, Mr. Virtual President. I want tough questions. I don't want softball questions. I want the hard questions. I want the questions that you've never either been able to explain to your liberal friends, or if you're a liberal, I want the questions that you would ask a conservative. Because you have preconceived notions about who we are and what we believe, and I'd like to, I don't know about change anybody's minds, but I'd like to at least make it clear what these things are. So do we have any questions?
I can just talk.
Probably easier.
Mr. President.
Mr. Virtual President, the real president will come after me if you don't call me Mr. Virtual President.
There are a number of us out here who you are governing that are very concerned with education. The education system in this country being infiltrated maybe 50, 60 years ago by socialists and into the universities now down into the grade schools and kindergartens,
right,
are obviously taking away our fundamental beliefs and the structure of this government, teaching our kids these notions of liberalism and progressive governance. Is there anything that you can see in the future that we can do to change that? Or is that so far down the track that it's hopeless?
Paradoxically, the answer to your question is both are true. It's so far down the track that it's hopeless, and there are things that we can do about that right now, not like someday from now. We've been doing them for 10 or 20 years. When we talked about parallel structures, this is in fact one of the greatest examples. And right now, one of these examples is homeschooling. Now, private schools certainly produce better results than public schools, but homeschool children have far better results than public school children. Far better. It's an enormous burden to homeschool your children. Enormous burden. You really, have 2 jobs. You've got whatever your job, and then you have a second job teaching your children, but you're doing it out of love, and so you're doing it out of love so you care about the results, right? You're not trying to indoctrinate them. You don't have time to waste. You've got to get science into their head, and mathematics, and English, and history. So you don't have time for all of this other nonsense. Homeschooling is a perfect example of parallel structures and how the world will change. I come from Los Angeles. The LA Unified School District is the largest, most monolithic, most unionized district in the country. I think at the moment, I forget what the number is, but I think there are 6,000 teachers who are permanently paid to do nothing because every single one of them has some sort of ethics or some sort of violation, and then they just won't fire them. They just pay them to sit in a room. Hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, whatever. You know, what's really ironic is you'll hear liberals say, oh, this is a mean-spirited, no-good-for-nothing, white, racist, horrible, conservative idea, this business of choosing where your kids go to school. But you know who the #1 supporter of private schools are, charter schools are? It's the people who live in the deep inner cities, whose children are not only dying emotionally, spiritually, and intellectually, but they're dying physically as well. Those people are begging for these charter schools to come in there, and it is the teachers' unions and the Democratic muscle that is legally barring them from doing so. So when I said our entire theory of government is based on wealth creation, freedom, and virtue, this is a perfect example. If you don't like the way your kids are being taught in school, homeschool them. That is a parallel structure. Now, I like to think that there are methods out there where we can talk about in the future where we can use people's collective voluntary contributions to set up a standard of maybe instructional aids, or here's a standard visual 7th grade course for the Civil War, whatever. Make it easier to homeschool people. But as this homeschooling movement begins to grow, and as we have this incredible internet, this is what I've been talking about with this third age economy, what's different now is, if you live in Steamboat Springs and you want to homeschool your kids, you can set up a Steamboat Springs homeschooling network. So you don't have to teach all the subjects yourself. You can have other people teach different, so you can diversify the labor. And I'm so glad you asked me about this, because the single greatest untapped resource in America today is not the energy, it's not the natural gas under our feet, it's not our technological base. The single greatest untapped resource in America today is retired people. It's a crime. It's an absolute crime. We have people who sit alone in basements who have had a lifetime of experience, a lifetime of real-world experience with nothing to do with their lives, nothing. Just watching time go by. These people are lifelong engineers. They could sit in a room full of 6th or 7th, 8th graders and teach them things about engineering that they wouldn't get at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. We should pay them for their time because they're worth their time. But we would do an incredible service to them, and we would do an incredible service to this horribly deprived youth that has never gotten an education in their lives. And the miracle about this third wave economy, about this new kind of government is, rather than the government coming in and unifying everything, what we should be doing is getting out of the way so that people in Steamboat Springs, as an example, can get together on a website and say, well, my uncle who's retired used to be a mathematics teacher. If we can have Thursday nights at 7, we'll teach mathematics to whoever wants to show up for free. And if you want to take a $5 donation, or if you want to pay $100 a year for this service, and this guy goes home with $2,000 or $1,700, you know he'd pay you to come and teach. I know retired people. It's an incredibly wasted asset. So we have this enormous excess of talent on one age group, and we have this enormous deficit of education on the other end. Why can't we put these two pieces together? Now, the beautiful thing about a parallel structure is we don't have to force at the point of a gun every single American in this country to go to your homeschool. We're about freedom and we're about choice. So I'm telling you that if you do something like this, your kids are going to get 1,700 on the SATs. Their kids are going to be working for your kids. And there's not a mother or father today who sends their kids to school who doesn't go, why is my kid so stupid and the Johnson's kid so smart? Why? Why does he know things and my kid doesn't? Oh, he goes to that homeschooling. How can I be a part of this? This is the idea of a parallel structure. It's a beacon. You don't have to force people to it. You light up a light and people will go to the light. That's one way we can deal with the education problem in the future. Next question. Yes, sir.
If we're about freedom and we're about choice, why does the Republican Party maintain its platform on abortion?
Excellent. Excellent. abortion, this is going to take a while, but you've asked a serious question, and you deserve a serious answer. I think we all deserve an answer. Abortion is the great dividing wedge of our time, because abortion places very squarely the concept of individual rights against group responsibilities, or at least certain people's ideas of group responsibilities. So, in order to make a point, because I'm not going to try to convince you one way or another, I'm trying to show you the solution to this problem, as much of a solution as we can have. First thing I need to do is I need to get you people to think about things in a non-ideological way. Raise your hands if you were on the side of the Confederacy during the Civil War. I'm not joking, and this isn't a trick. Okay? Raise your hands if you were on the side of the Union during the Civil War. Were you on the side of the Union because the Union was anti-slavery? Yes. So was I. I was in favor of the Union. In fact, it was a violation of state rights, but I was on the Union side. I'm trying to get to your point here, sir, so here's what I'm trying to make. During the Civil War, the entire war and 800,000 Americans died over a single ideological issue. One single thought caused the Civil War. If slaves are not human beings, if slaves are not people, and many people didn't think they were, if slaves are not people, and if slaves are in fact property, then the North is completely wrong. The South has a right to their property. The North didn't invade them to take away their horses or their cattle or their cotton fields. If slaves are property, the South is right. The Civil War was an act of aggression, absolutely uncalled for. Federal usurpation of their rights to their property. It's pretty clear. Now, if slaves are people, then it's a whole different story, right? Because they had a legal right to own those slaves. When they seceded from the Union, they still had the legal right to own those slaves. But if slaves are not property, if black people are actually human beings, right, then you don't have a right to own them. And it doesn't matter what laws there are in place. You have a moral obligation to prevent this horror. And that was the entire cause of the North. That was the entire cause of the abolition movement. And all of us today who understand, having dealt with black people in the way that those people never dealt with them, of course they're people. We look back on slavery as a great horror because it's obvious that they're people, but it wasn't obvious back then. So if they're people, we have a right to violate their privacy, right? Right? We have a right to go into their plantations and burn their houses to the ground to free the lives of people. If they're not people, it's just an invasion. Now, I'm not going to use the term pro-life, and I'm not going to use the term pro-choice, because these are marketing terms. These are advertising terms designed to make our side look good. I'm going to be very specific. I'm going to say pro-abortion and anti-abortion, because it is a procedure, and that's the procedure we're talking about. It doesn't prejudice one side or another. We're talking about the procedure. The anti-abortion people have a position that is the same as the positions of the abolitionists. They believe that what is going on is the murdering of people. You don't have to agree that they're people. Obviously, the people who are pro-abortion rights don't believe they're people, right? But this is the issue. And the real problem here is that if you think about it, because it really comes down to this, it really does, doesn't it? I mean, we cut away all of the nonsense. What it really does come down to is that fetus a human being, yes or no? It's safe and we want it rare? It doesn't seem to be any of those things to me. And it is morally repugnant. As a matter of fact, let me just add one thing here. Because we say that the federal government, that the Constitution doesn't have a say in any of these issues. True, it doesn't, but it does have a very important say about one thing. And the one thing that the Constitution says very clearly, it's not in the 17th Amendment, it's not in the 8th Amendment, it's in the First Amendment. The very first thing in the Bill of Rights says that the government does not have the power to make people do something that is against their religion. And that means the government does not have the power to force somebody to pay for abortions because they find it religiously reprehensible. That has to be enforced. Has to be enforced. And if your position is that these people are going to go to hell, well, then that's it. We have to live together on this issue. But that is an inviolate right of Americans. That is the entire reason we're on this continent, is because the government doesn't get to tell us what we believe in our religious beliefs. So that's the best answer I can give you. It's not a perfect answer. It probably makes nobody happy. What do? We deal with it locally. We deal with it as best we can. And we get out there and try to convince people that if you believe strongly one way or another, do your best to convince them. But we don't have a right to live in a country where other people's actions don't offend us. Because that argument never ends. I don't like what you're saying because you're a liberal. I don't like what you're saying because you're conservative. I don't like what you're saying because you're this. You know what? You can take that all the way down to the grassroots. I went to the University of Florida. I think the Florida State Seminoles are a bunch of degenerate, low-life scum. They think I'm an arrogant, strutting, obnoxious fathead. I don't have a right not to be offended by what they say about me. I just have to do the best I can. Next question. Yes, sir.
Yes, Mr. Virtual President, I would submit that you are, at least in part, a victim of the Los Angeles Unified School District.
I'm not with the British schools.
You have submitted to us that the Civil War was fought over slavery. However, the North was invading the South for 2 years before Mr. Lincoln wrote the Emancipation Proclamation, and in that proclamation, he only freed the slaves in the Confederacy. He did not free the slaves who remained in the Union. I would submit to you that the Civil War was over economic issues.
Well, I will reply. The Emancipation Proclamation, as you clearly pointed out, was issued 2 years after the Civil War began. But the fact of the matter is that Abraham Lincoln was elected in November, and 7 states of the Deep South, the original 7 states of the Deep Confederacy, were out of the Union before he was sworn into office. They left the Union before Abraham Lincoln was president. They left the Union before he was president. The Emancipation Proclamation freed only the slaves in enemy territory because Lincoln did not have the constitutional authority to free all the slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation was predicated on a military priority. Lincoln's authority for the Emancipation Proclamation was that this was contraband of war that was helping the Confederate war effort, and he issued that proclamation not as President of the United States, but as Commander-in-Chief of the Union armies. So Lincoln's proclamation was simply the best that he could do with the legal power he had. Now, the 13th Amendment originally was going to be an amendment that was going to guarantee the rights of slaveholders to keep their slaves. But the South went out of the Union before Lincoln was sworn in. Abraham Lincoln hadn't even taken the oath of office. Forget about any particular policies might have been forced. Hadn't even taken the oath of office when the states of the Deep South were already out of the Union. And they were out of the Union because they knew that the election of a Republican president meant the eventual destruction of slavery, because the Republican Party was predicated on one thing only, and that was the elimination of slavery in the United States. They weren't going to do it by force of law. The reason the South took their football home and left at the beginning of the Civil War was because the South knew that as new states were coming into the Union, they were voting to come in as free states. They knew that every single state that was added to the Union from this point forward was going to decrease their political power, and so they left. And Lincoln, by the way, who was pretty astute, made sure that it was the South that fired the first shot of that war. It was the South that fired the first shots of that war. The Union didn't start that war. They didn't pull the first trigger. The Confederacy did. Lincoln said, I am going to resupply the American fort at Fort Sumter. That is a Union garrison in Fort Sumter. I am going to supply them with food and supplies so they don't starve. The Confederacy said, if you try to supply Fort Sumter, we're going to open fire. They tried to supply the fort. The South opened fire, and everything happened after that. I didn't go to Unified School District in LA, because if I had, I wouldn't known any of this stuff without an actual education. Next question.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
You talk about these parallel structures and how much better they would be than this monolithic structure we have right now. How would we ever get from here to there? I don't see, the people in Congress aren't going to give up their power. They're not going to give up their votes. How do you get from here to there?
You brought up an interesting point that I probably should have elaborated a little more clearly, because we have to understand something. The government now has so much power. There's so much power, so much authority, coercive power. It's the most powerful force in the history of the world. And it's being co-opted by people who are no longer limited by the document that they swore to uphold. So how do we do this? Well, the first thing that we have to do is we have to understand this in our bones. In our bones. We cannot break any laws. and we have to pay our taxes. Even if it means we do it a little late. We have to pay our taxes. Because if we don't break any laws and we pay our taxes, they can't do anything to us. Right? And the tragedy here, it's a temporary tragedy, and when I say temporary, maybe 20, 30, 40 years worth. But the tragedy with parallel structures is you're really paying for things twice. If you're going to have a parallel education system, you're paying for your kids' education twice. You're paying it out of your taxes, which go to the public education that they're not going to attend. You have to pay for it again, voluntarily, to get it done right. But as long as it's a voluntary action on your part, a voluntary association, whatever money changes hands is taxed and all of the laws are followed, they really can't stop you. What you're saying is, what we cannot do is we cannot say, I'm going to withhold my education taxes from the government and put it over here. This is the entire argument about the vouchers thing, which is why it's fought tooth and nail. We're saying, no, I'm not even asking for vouchers. No, it's all right. Knock yourself out. Knock yourself out, run your public schools. My kid's just not going to be there. I'm going to take my time and my money and effort to do again what you guys didn't do for the money and the time you've already taken away from me. And then look, if it turns out that the government starts coming out with specifically targeted micro laws to stop this kind of thing, that's when we as conservatives finally have to show up to the polls, right, and not sit this one out. We just have to show up and say, this law, H.R. 2294, which nobody seems to care about, which limits no, we're going to take that all the way to the top. We're going to take that to the Supreme Court. We're going to make this a live or die issue. Because they will try to stop us legally. But when I say that the new government, the new future is faster, lighter, networked, it's much quicker. These people are idiots. We're not going to have any problem with them. We just need to be ahead of them. We need to be inside their decision loop. We have to be faster and quicker than them. And if they decide to put legal roadblocks that are specifically designed to stop us, then we have to get into the polls and call our politicians and say, this obscure law that no one's ever heard of, if you don't vote for this, you're done. And then if it turns out they still, then we change the loopholes, right? I mean, in California, I have an AR-15. In California, I can't have a detachable magazine. So they wrote a law that says that as long as I can't remove the magazine with my finger, if I have to use a tool, it's not a detachable magazine. So they put a little guard on this thing. I can't do it with my finger. If I take a round of .223 ammunition, I can do it. It drops right out. It's called the bullet button. So there's an example of a stupid law that's designed to accomplish a specific stupid purpose that is then rapidly circumvented by people who are smarter than the people who made the law. And that's how we have to do it. Anybody else? All right. Well, thank you very much for coming. I hope you had a good time.